All right, everyone. Full house today. Okay, so the name of this lecture was actually just Game Theory and Network Attacks. But as we were writing this lecture, we added the How to Destroy Bitcoin because we found so many vulnerabilities with Bitcoin. So if you're a skeptic of Bitcoin, today is your lecture. Yeah. I'm going to be talking about mining pools, giving some background first. Then we're going to talk about the whole variety of different attacks that occur, or that theoretically can occur in Bitcoin from a game theoretical standpoint. Okay, so mining pools. Last time we didn't really cover mining pools. Oh, by the way, we have 50 slides, so I'm going to be going pretty fast. A lot of material. Okay, so mining pools. We didn't cover that last time because we wanted to really get the mechanics going for you guys. It's not really worth it to cover it by itself without actually talking about the game theory. So essentially, mining pools allow individual miners to pool their computational power together. The main reason is that it reduces variance in mining rewards. And usually the pool manager takes some cut of the mining rewards earned by that pool. There's some benefits and some drawbacks. The main benefit is that it allows individual miners to participate in the process. So in a sense, you can think of it as democratizing. And it also makes it really easy to upgrade the network. So whenever you want to push out a new software update for Bitcoin, only the pool operators have to update it, and they essentially update it on behalf of all the pool participants. Obviously, some of the cons are that you need to trust the pool manager, and it's a form of centralization, which kind of goes against the whole idea of Bitcoin. And the fact that we have these pools enables a whole series of attacks that we're going to be talking about today. So just a quick example of why we want to use mining pools. Suppose you wanted to start Bitcoin mining today. You can buy a state-of-the-art Antminer S9 for $2,400, and that's going to hash for 14 terahash per second. So let's do some nap-in calculations to see when you're going to get your money. Today's network hash rate is 1.7 million terahash per second. So your percentage of the network hash rate is roughly 7.8 e to the negative fourth percent of the network hash rate. And if you look at the expected annual reward, it's not that bad. You're going to get $3,300 a year. But when you're solo mining, your reward schedule is really spread out. You're actually going to get $8,000 once every 2 years, 5 months. You know, in the next 2 years, 5 months, your Antminer S9 is probably going to be inefficient. You're probably going to be losing a lot of money. So why we want to use a mining pool is you can get that reward much more evenly over time. So suppose your pool has 1/6 of the network hash rate, and you receive a reward every time your pool finds a block. You're going to receive 38 cents every hour, which is much more doable than $8,000 every 2.5 years. But the thing about this, you can see, this is kind of a paradox. Like the more secure Bitcoin gets, like the higher in value Bitcoin gets, the more we need mining pools because individual miners are going to have an even smaller of the total pie, and they need to consolidate together to have any kind of reduced variance in rewards. Here's a quick graphic of mining pool hash rate distribution from blockchain.info last night. Just a few quick notes. So the community generally exhibits backlash against large centralized mining pools. So one example of this is ghash.io back in 2014. They were actually surpassing 51% of the network hash rate. And then miners willingly left that pool, and then ghash closed off new miners from joining because it was actually becoming a big problem. But this was primarily because their incentives were so attractive to miners. And another thing, there's something called laundering hashes, where a single entity might be multiple of these pools. The scary thing about this is it's unknown where the actual concentration of control over the mining hardware is. Because when you receive blocks, it's just from some IP address, could be wherever in the world, and you don't have any information. So that's like a scary thing. Bitcoin could be really centralized, and we don't even know it. So how do pools actually work? you need to prove that you're contributing to the pool. And you do this through something called a share, which is essentially a near valid block. So suppose, like, to find a valid block, you need to find 60 leading zeros in the resulting hash output. For a share of the pool could be, oh, you only need to find 30 leading zeros. And submitting a lot of these shares proves that you're hashing on that proof of work. And how you do it is, like, the pool operator pays for these valid shares, and it's distributed proportional to the amount of work that you've contributed to the pool. And another key detail to note is that valid blocks are shares as well. But the thing is, typically when you submit a valid block, you're not going to be rewarded any extra, even though you just earned the pool another 12.5 Bitcoin. It's because during the rest of the time when your shares weren't valid blocks, you were also receiving money. So it kind of balances out that way. A frequently asked question with mining pools and shares is, oh, why doesn't someone submit shares in a pool and then just, when they find the valid block, just keep that valid block and keep the reward for themselves? The reason for this is that the problem that you're solving is given to you by the pool operator. So we always say, okay, you're hashing the previous block hash and along with a Merkle root. Well, the Merkle root contains all the transactions, which has a Coinbase transaction referencing the pool operator's public key. So because you can't just arbitrarily change the public key in the Merkle root and have it still be a valid problem, the only thing you can do is, once you find a valid block, not actually give it to the pool. So there's two basic reward schemes that are covered in the textbook. The first is paper share, and the second is proportional. Paper share is pretty simple. It pays out at every share that you submit, and just by default, it's going to be proportional to the work that you've done. And this is more beneficial for miners because the miners have absolutely no risk from reward variance. In essence, the pool takes on the variance completely. But the problem is there's no incentive for individuals to actually submit these valid blocks. They can attack the pool and do so at no cost. And the individuals are paid regardless. In a proportional scheme, the pool only pays out when blocks are found. And this is more beneficial for the pool because they only pay out when the reward is actually found. And this actually creates an incentive for the individuals in the pool to submit their valid blocks. There's still some risk and variance proportional to the size of the pool, but it's not really a problem if it's sufficiently large. Like in our example, if your pool has 1/6 of the network hash rate, you're receiving a payment every hour, which is not a problem at all. It's much better than 2 years, 5 months. And so there's a strategy, given these two pool types, called pool hopping. The issue with proportional pools is that shortly after a block is found, there's going to be a much higher reward per share because there were less shares that have been found so far. Because remember, when you're mining in a proportional pool, the shares you submit correspond to a particular block. So you can see in this graph here, rewards per share for a paper share pool is constant. It's always normalized by the share of the network hash rate that the pool has and the expected number of shares that will be needed before you find a valid block. But with the proportional pool, there's a big drop-off. There's a huge potential for reward shortly after the block was found. So the clever mining strategy would be to mine at the proportional pool while your expected rewards are higher, and then switch to the paper share pool once the proportional pool is less profitable. Therefore, proportional pools are not feasible in practice because this kind of cheats the honest miners that were mining at the proportional pool and sticking with it. And so this is actually still an open problem. Designing a mining pool reward scheme that has these aligned incentives and that is not vulnerable to this pool hopping is still an open problem. Right here, we took a screenshot of the Bitcoin wiki. This is actually a quick laundry list of the whole number of different reward schemes used by mining pools. There's a lot of papers on here too. So if you're interested, this is a pretty cool field. Here's a quick comparison of just some different pools, the different algorithms they use, and some of their properties. All right, so now we're going to be talking about some malicious mining profit strategies. So typically when you're mining Bitcoin, there's a default strategy implemented by the Bitcoin QT client. That implies certain things like, oh, you're always going to be mining on the longest chain, you're always going to broadcast your block as soon as you find it. You're always going to include every transaction in the block that has ordered by the highest fee. But there's a lot of variations in those choices that you can make, and a lot of ways that you can kind of try to cheat the system in order to get more reward than the honest strategy. So there's something called, we sometimes refer to as pool wars. So suppose you have 30% of the network hash rate, and just to make the math easier, we're going to assume that the block reward is 1 Bitcoin. And all the numbers in this slide are expected value. So when you have 30% of the hash rate, that means you're going to have 30% mining reward, which means your expected value per block is 0.3 Bitcoin. Now you want to upgrade your mining software. You're going to buy another 1% worth of mining hardware, plug it in. So the default mining strategy is to just continue mining in your pool or your wherever you're mining currently. But the thing is that actually doesn't increase your revenue as much because you also increase the total network hash rate. So instead of 31 over 100, it's actually 31 over 101 units of computational power, which calculates out to 30.69% of the hash rate. Expected value is 30.69 or 0.3069 Bitcoin. So the revenue gain for this one additional percent of hash power is 0.0069 Bitcoin. That's an important number. Now let's look at the alternative strategy. You can do something called cannibalizing a pool where you distribute your 1% equally among all the other pools, for example, and you withhold the valid blocks. You submit valid shares, but you don't submit the valid blocks. And so you're still being paid by that pool. And it's also really hard to detect. You can do stuff like, oh, is this statistically significant? But that's really getting to some hand-wavy stuff. So if you break down the hash rate of the other pools, on average, there is 70 out of 71 proportion of the pool is honest hash power from that pool. And then you own that last 71st bit of it. So the hash rate of that pool is 70% of the original 100% hash rate, and the expected value of that would be 0.7 BTC. So 0.7 BTC is the expected value that this pool is going to get. Now, since you own 171 of that pool, you're actually going to get a share of that expected value. So you multiply those two values together, and you get 0.0098 Bitcoin. So what we've just shown is that it's actually much more profitable to cannibalize a pool than it is to mine honestly. You can imagine like all the different problems arising from this.
Can you say that we can't like withhold the valid blocks?
Yeah, you can withhold the block and you would still get paid by the pool. The only what you can't do is receive the mining reward from that block. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so, question?
If you just like withhold the block, then how does it get? Does you wait till someone else finds it?
Well, you withhold the block and you basically just waste that money. Yeah, waste that potential money. Yeah. Okay, another strategy. We're just going to keep on going like all the ways Bitcoin can fail. So this is called selfish mining and block withholding in a different context. Instead of withholding valid blocks submitting to a pool, you're actually withholding a valid block that you found submitting to the network. So the basic idea is that suppose you're a miner or mining pool, you own some percentage of the network hash rate, and you've just found a block. What you want to do is instead of announcing that block to the network, you're actually going to keep that block secret. And your objective is to try to find another block on top of your block before the network finds their next block. And why you want to do this? So suppose you succeed in finding the second hidden block. Now you can continue mining on your chain. But once the network finds their block, you're able to invalidate it. You invalidate it by, you have two hidden blocks and the network has only one hidden block. Once you broadcast the chain, all the other nodes see, this is the longer chain. Let's switch to this longer chain. And what you've essentially done is you've orphaned this new block that the network was previously working on. And the key insight of this is that while the network was mining on this invalid block, you got a bunch of time to mine by yourself for free. And mining by yourself for free means that the other people had less hash power contributed to the problem, you have more hash power contributed to the problem. Therefore, you will have a higher expected profit of mining if you use this block withholding strategy. So looking at the other case, so you found your hidden block, you're trying to find your second block. Oh no, the network found their next block. So now what happens is it's a race to get propagated. So suppose, okay, there's 2 blocks. Now you have a 50% of winning this race and having your block accepted. Even with that 50% chance of winning the race, this malicious strategy is more profitable if you have over 25% of the mining power. And if you have over 33% of the mining power, you can win or you can lose literally every single race, and malicious mining using block withholding is still going to be more profitable for you. Yeah. So any questions?
How can it still be possible if you use the race to create or to find the next block?
You wouldn't be able to find the next block. What would happen is when you lose the race, your block is orphaned. So then you just kind of have to start over again. You'll wait until the next time that you find your own block, and then you keep it secret again, and it repeats.
Right, so if you, as the person inside, use the race every time, then how can that be profitable?
Oh, because this case only occurs when you've found one secret block, and then the network finds their next valid block before you find your second secret block. Yeah. Okay. All right, so now Philip's going to be talking about double spending a lot more rigorously than we have before.
Yeah, so previously we've talked about double spending in kind of a hand-wavy sense. Like, oh, if the malicious attacker has over 50% of the hash power, they can double spend. But why exactly is that? And so I'm going to go into a bit more detail on why that's true. And of course, let me quickly review on what double spending is. So double spending is where you have, your money, and you want to be able to spend it twice, essentially. So suppose Bob is selling an iPhone 0-day exploit on the black market for $1.5 million worth of Bitcoin. That's actually like a true story. You can try to double spend Bob by essentially buying the 0-day from him. So he gets this transaction. He's like, oh, it's a nice transaction. Cool. I got my $1.5 million of Bitcoin. He sends you the 0-day, and then through a double spend attack, you simultaneously manage to send the money back to yourself or to another address you control. And we're going to go into that, how that actually works. So basically what the end result is you get this like high-value iPhone 0-day exploit, and meanwhile spend no money. So that is the key point of the double spend. So how that actually works, or actually quickly we're going to go over confirmations. So if you recall, confirmation is basically like this is my transaction in some block that's already been mined. And suppose that the network has actually mined 2 more blocks on top of this block. That means that my transaction has 2 confirmations. In other words, it has 2 blocks on top of it. And so what we mean by confirmations is basically the more confirmations, the more blocks you have mined on top of your transactions block, the safer your transaction is. In other words, the less likely that someone is going to be able to announce a separate fork that invalidates your transaction. But what exactly is the probability of someone being able to all of a sudden mine a fork and then invalidate your transaction? So if we consider the first case where Bob is actually not waiting for any transactions before sending you the exploit, it's actually fairly simple to do a double spend attack. And basically what happens is, say you're Alice, you're the one trying to send Bob the money. So what you do is you create one transaction, which is sending money from you, Alice, to Bob with the 2350 Bitcoin. And you also simultaneously create another transaction, we'll call it TX2, sending money from Alice to Alice Prime, or another address controlled by Alice. And what you do is you send Bob this first transaction, and Bob sees, oh, hey, it's a valid transaction. It's not spending money twice from the view that I have at this current point in time. But simultaneously, you send this other transaction, TX2, sending money back to yourself to basically the rest of the network. So when Bob gets his transaction, he sends you the goods, but at the same time, this transaction is propagating faster, and so you get what's called a race attack, where this transaction basically like takes precedence and gets mined into the blockchain before this transaction. So in a sense, you managed to steal the zero-day exploit from Bob without spending any of your money. Yeah.
Doesn't this depend on the second transaction being prioritized by other miners?
Yeah. So it's not guaranteed to work, but it works pretty effectively. There's a paper that shows how you can get this to work with like pretty high probability. The key here is that you send only Bob this transaction, whereas you send the rest of the network your other transaction. And so because everyone else is getting this transaction, it propagates. In other words, like the network like reaches consensus that this is the valid one, and this one gets into the block. Or what you can also do is you can increase the fee on your other transaction. So if you all of a sudden you had like a 1 Bitcoin fee on this transaction, miners gonna be like, oh hey, that's like a free Bitcoin. Let me like stick that in my block, as opposed to this one which has like no fee, for example. So yeah, this is basically how you can get free coffee. If you go to a coffee shop that accepts Bitcoin, you can go up to them, pay with Bitcoin, do a race attack. Meanwhile, you get the coffee and you like book it. Free coffee. So yeah, that's why we generally recommend if you're a merchant or something accepting Bitcoin, you wait for some number of confirmations. So we're going to consider Bob, who waits for Z confirmations in the general case. So basically what Bob wants to do is he gets your transaction, it gets mined into the blockchain, and he waits for Z confirmations on top of that transaction before he actually sends you the goods. So in this case, let's say Bob waits for 2 confirmations. We've got this blockchain. You send Bob the transaction, sending him money. That gets mined into a block and added onto the blockchain. And as this is going on, the honest network is mining more blocks. People are spending money, and it keeps building on top of this. And so when you have 2 confirmations, Bob sends you the goods. Now, how we can double spend is Alice, in secret, is actually mining her own like Alice to Alice Prime transaction and building blocks in secret. So the honest network, can't see this. They're just like, oh, this is the longest chain. We're gonna keep mining on here. Meanwhile, Alice is mining in secret, and if she has enough hash power, she can mine enough blocks, and then all of a sudden, broadcast this this block, and the entire network sees, oh, this is the longest block, or the longest blockchain. And so everyone starts mining off of this block now, which means that at this point, Bob has sent you the goods, sent Alice the goods, but he never actually received the money because this is no longer the accepted view of like the blockchain history. So that's how we do a double spend. Now we're going to look at what the probability that Alice can actually perform a double spend, given that she has some amount of hash power. Because you can see here, Alice has to have sufficient hash power to generate enough blocks in secret before she can broadcast it. Yeah?
What if Bob, going off the honest blockchain, decides that he's like going to immediately spend all of the Bitcoin that he just received? Like,
Yeah.
Where does the Bitcoin actually go then? Like, he's like, okay, I'm going to take all my Bitcoin and like pay in dollars for
Right.
something, and then Alice is like, no, this is the new blockchain. Look at some of my money.
Yeah, so in that case, Bob is sending money to, Charlie, who's an exchange operator. And in that case, Charlie is probably also waiting for Z confirmations on Bob's transaction. And so, in this case, let's say this next block contains Bob to Charlie. Charlie's not going to send Bob the US dollars because it's not going to have, 2 confirmations or something. The thing is, with the case of like blockchains, or like spending money from a blockchain, all that matters is like the longest blockchain or the block with like the most height. And so that's the only like view of like history that matters in this case. So Bob, is basically screwed out of his money and the goods that he sent you.
If the two confirmations are reached, Bob can essentially double spend on Charlie, because Bob was originally the one being double spent on, so long as he receives the goods before the dishonest miner closes the fork.
Right. Actually, yeah. If Charlie was a one confirmation, like if Charlie was only waiting for one confirmation, and Bob sent Charlie the Bitcoin here in exchange for the U.S. dollars, Bob would actually get the U.S. dollars, but Charlie would now be the one screwed out of the money. Yeah.
So in other words, Alice can double spend on Bob, and Bob can double spend on Charlie. And
Yeah.
both of them double spending the initial money still works.
Yeah, more or less.
Wow.
So now we're going to look at the actual probability of Alice being able to double spend. So we're first going to define a few things. First, suppose that Alice has h sub a amount of hash power in terahashes or petahashes, exahashes. And then we consider the total network hash power, which is going to be the honest network's hash power plus Alice's hash power. So with this, we can determine the probability that the honest network generates a block. And that's going to be the honest network's hash power over the total hash power. We'll call that P. Now the probability of Alice finding a block is 1 minus P, or the Alice's hash power over the total hash power. So because generating a block is a discrete event, we can model this as a Poisson distribution, or let me think about this. So we consider the case where the honest network generates Z blocks. So the honest network has generated 5 blocks, for example. Now we want to look at what the probability the expected number of blocks that Alice was able to generate in that same amount of time. So the honest network generated 5 blocks. How many blocks could Alice generate? Well, if we look at the case where Q is less than P, we basically get Z times Q over P, which is the expected number of blocks. And now if we turn that into a Poisson distribution, because it's a rate of blocks generated, we can look at the probability that Alice has generated K blocks in that amount of time, which follows this typical Poisson distribution. So next we want to look at a related problem. Alice is J blocks behind the honest network. What is the probability that Alice will ever be able to catch up? In other words, generate J blocks over an unlimited amount of time. And so this has a special name called the gambler's ruin problem. And I'm gonna not really prove that right now, but I'll just claim that the probability that Alice can ever catch up to the main network if she's J blocks behind is this, which is P over Q to the J. Or if Alice has over 50% of the hash power, this is actually 1 always in expectation, because with a greater than 50% hash power, we just say that in expectation she will always be able to outspeed the network. So combining these two probability distributions, we look at the probability that Alice, given that the honest network has generated Z blocks, what is the probability that Alice will at the same time have been able to generate more than Z blocks? In other words, what is the probability that she can double spend the network? So how we do this is we basically sum over every k to infinity, where k is the number of blocks that Alice generated in that meantime, times for each probability that she generated those k blocks, times the probability that she'll ever catch up to the network from generating those k blocks. So math and stuff. Math, simplify, get this nice expression. So we get these cool plots of this probability distribution. So let me explain this real quick. So this is the probability that Alice can successfully double spend, given that she has some proportion of the total network hash power. So if she has 50% of the hash power, she will always be able to double spend. If she has 10% of the hash power, and Bob waits for 2 or let's say Bob waits for 1 confirmation before sending her the goods, Alice will have about a 20% chance of being able to successfully double spend on Bob if she has 10% of the network, or 10% of the relative network hash power. And this, you can see, kind of goes down as the number of confirmations tends towards infinity. And also, what's kind of scary is 10% is probably the hash power of like a medium large size pool. 30% would be like maybe 2 pools or 3 pools like colluding. And so with 3 pools, if you're only waiting like 3 or 2 confirmations, they can pretty much like half the time double spend on you. And even if you wait for the recommended 6 number of blocks or the 6 number of confirmations, a pool collusion can probably like double spend on you with 20% probability. And so you have to remember, like 6 confirmations is like an hour. So if you're a coffee shop owner, you're not going to wait an hour before giving someone your coffee. That doesn't make any sense. So, if you're a merchant, you really have to consider like what the value of the good that you're selling is, and the assumed hash power of your adversary. Or whatever. So if we just like flip this over, from the merchant's perspective, like how safe am I, given that my assumed adversary has such amount of like hash power. So if it's 10% hash power, you can see like, I should probably wait maybe like 3 or 4 confirmations. If I assume that I'm like against a government entity, I'm probably screwed either way. Yeah, so this is why it's tough in like a Bitcoin system, because you have this like consistency that like gets better over time. But in the case where your adversary has a lot of power, your consistency is like only growing very slowly over time. So it's hard to be safe in this case. And so if you consider Alice, where she might not actually own the ASIC chips to actually do this, she can actually bribe miners to do mining on her private chain when she's trying to do the double spend. And so like I said, she might not physically own the miners, but she can bribe pools. She can do extortion or like blackmailing or something. Lots of fun stuff. Another interesting attack is called the Goldfinger attack. And so what you have to consider is, like, from everyone else's perspective, if they can see that someone is successfully double spending on the Bitcoin network, then they know that someone has enough hash power to consistently, like, basically get free money, or get free goods, I guess. But what the key hypothesis is that if someone detects a double spend, the confidence in the network and the confidence in the security of the currency basically plummets. And that means the exchange rate probably also plummets. So if Alice is a government adversary or like large financial institution or like an adversarial altcoin, she could actually like short Bitcoin and use that as like collateral to like effectively get enough ASIC chips to then double spend on the network, cause the confidence to crash, and then make the money back. Or if she has like additional utility from destroying the currency, who knows? Like she might be totally willing to just like at a loss buy a bunch of ASIC chips and then destroy the network. So scary stuff. And this is like why a government entity is like so scary, because they have trillions of dollars at hand to buy like more ASIC chips than the entire like Bitcoin network combined, and just like instantly destroy the network. So yeah, Max is going to talk about blacklisting.
All right. So we keep on saying that Bitcoin and distributed systems are censorship resistant. Let's reevaluate that claim. All right. So blacklisting via something called punitive forking. So suppose you're a government that has jurisdiction over a lot of mining pools, like China. Bitcoin core developers are really worried about China. And your objective is to censor the Bitcoin addresses owned by certain people. Let's pick someone that Bitcoiners like, Garrett Johnson, and then prevent Garrett Johnson from spending or receiving any of his Bitcoin. So quick legend, here's a normal block. Here's a block mined by Chinese miners where you can feel the wrath of Mao. And here's a good old Gary Johnson right here. All right. So the naive strategy is, first, okay, I'm China. I'm going to tell my country's mining pools not to include Johnson's transaction. And this doesn't work unless you're literally the entire Bitcoin network. Because so long as some other miner has some proportion of the hash rate, they're going to find a block eventually, and they're going to be able to include Gary Johnson's transaction. So the only real thing you can do with this is you can cause just delays and inconveniences. But with a more clever strategy, remember, you're China, and you have over 51% of the network hash rate under your jurisdiction. Simply mandate that these Chinese pools will refuse to work on a chain containing transactions to or from Gary Johnson's Bitcoin address. And an important part of this is you want to announce this to the world. So down here in this diagram, you can see, okay, there's a transaction with Johnson, and then China wants to fork. Now what happens is if these non-Chinese miners include this transaction from Johnson in a block, China's going to fork down here. And the block containing Johnson's transaction is now invalidated because you're China. You have more than 51% of hash rate, and you're going to be always creating a longer proof of work chain. So essentially, you mine these 3 blocks, and you release those blocks, and now like your chain is a valid chain. Gary Johnson can no longer send or receive Bitcoin. So eventually, these non-Chinese miners are going to stop trying to include Johnson's transaction because they know that their blocks are going to be invalidated. They're just wasting a bunch of hash power when they try to mine for Gary Johnson. So now the other miners are going to start blacklisting Gary Johnson as well. So basically we've shown that how any 51% majority can just blacklist anyone arbitrarily on the network. This is called punitive forking.
Yeah, like how you can block from an address from spending, but how do you like block it from receiving? Like you can just use another address.
Yeah, that is true. You would have to scan for the aliases. So I guess if you would still have to know Gary Johnson's address in either case. So that's just like an implementation detail. Question? Over. Okay, so we've shown how you can do it with over 51%, but what if you have less than 51%? And from a game theoretical standpoint, this is actually possible as well. This is called feather forking, and essentially what you do is you announce that you will attempt to fork if you see a block from Gary Johnson. But after a while, you're going to give up. In the punitive forking scheme, you're actually attempting to fork forever, and it doesn't work without 51%. So, for example, you'll say, I'm going to give up on forking if there's K confirmations on Gary Johnson's block, some arbitrary K. Now let Q equal the proportion of the mining power that you have between 0 and 1, as Philip had defined earlier. Let K is 1, so you're going to wait, or you're going to give up after 1 confirmation, 1 additional block. So the chance of successfully orphaning the Johnson block means you need to be the person that finds 2 blocks in a row. So you need to win twice, which is Q times Q, or Q squared. This is actually not very good from a just purely orphaning this block standpoint, because say you have 20% of the network hash rate, Q squared is only a 4% chance of actually orphaning this block. That's not very powerful. But once these other miners are aware that their block has a Q squared chance of being orphaned, they now need to decide whether they still want to include Gary Johnson's transaction in the block. So you can calculate the expected value of the block reward given that they include Gary Johnson's transaction or they don't. In the case that they include, you have to multiply the block reward by the probability that they actually find that block, and then you can add on Johnson's transaction fee. And in the normal case where they exclude Gary Johnson, they just get the normal block reward. So if you're looking at this math, unless Gary Johnson pays Q squared, Q squared times the block reward in fees to compensate these miners for accepting that risk of taking on his transaction. These other miners are going to mine on the malicious chain. And what's 4% of the block reward? That's actually half a Bitcoin, which means that Johnson needs to pay a minimum of $321 per transaction that he wants to include in the blockchain if he wants the incentives to be aligned. You could say that, oh, if Johnson has a big pool of money, 321 isn't that much of a deal if you just need to make like one transaction out. But if you're able to blacklist the transactions going into his address, all the donations have to also have 321 transactions. So that makes it pretty much infeasible to donate to Gary Johnson's campaign. All right, so now Philip's going to be talking about some network attacks.
Right, so I'm just going to really quickly talk about a really cool attack called time jacking. So basically, just a quick background, every node on the Bitcoin network has to keep track of time, but they also have to keep track of time of like every other peer. In other words, they need to be like keep staying in sync with every other peer. So how they do that is they have an internal clock time, and their internal clock time is computed as the median clock time of all the reported clock times of its peers. And then another quick property is that if the median clock time differs by more than 70 minutes to their like system clock time, they'll actually just reset to the system clock time. And as a precaution, this is the key, nodes reject new blocks that are more than 2 hours ahead of their internal clock time. So let's say you're an attacker. You launch what's called a Sybil attack, meaning you spawn like 1,000, 10,000 Bitcoin nodes. And remember, Bitcoin nodes don't really cost anything to launch because you don't have to do any mining or proof of work. And so for the target node, you report to the target node that all of your fake nodes have a clock time that's set 70 minutes behind the real time. So the target node now has a clock time that's set like back 70 minutes in the past. For every other node, you report a clock time of 70 minutes ahead of the real time. And so what this does is you have this like 140-minute gap in like perceived time between the target node and every other node. So basically what you want to do is the attacker with enough hash power mines a new block and sets the timestamp to be 190 minutes ahead of the real time. So remember, if the new block is out of like 120 minutes ahead of a node's internal time, it'll reject it. So for all of the rest of the network, they see this new block, see that's like 120 minutes within their bound, and they accept it. So they start mining on that new block. Except now the target is basically like partitioned from the network and is out of sync. So they see like, oh, this new block is invalid, it's too far in the future, we're just going to ignore it. Except now, that target node is basically, like I said, like out of the network. They're totally out of sync. And as long as the attacker can maintain this like time gap, the target node is like cut off. And this means that if you're trying to do a double spend attack, you have like unlimited time now to generate a bunch of free blocks, basically, that you can then send, basically feed to the target these like basically pseudo or mined blocks that you've had unlimited time to generate, and they're like, oh, it's fine, let me send you the goods. Yeah?
How much computational power do you need for a time check?
Yeah, so the key is, like I said, to spawn a Bitcoin node, you don't actually need any like ASIC chips, you don't need any mining power, because a Bitcoin node is just validating transactions. And what you're doing is all you're doing is just like reporting the wrong time to this other node. So you just need a bunch of like IP addresses, basically. So although there is like a prerequisite to be able to mine some blocks in like probably a good amount of time, so you do need some like hash power on the side. But basically what you can do, like I said, is you have in the case where you can maintain this like time gap for an unlimited amount of time. You have, like I said, an unlimited amount of time to double spend on them, which means you can always double spend on them. If you have a restricted time window, meaning the node has like some special logic to like detect this attack. Even if you have like 140 minutes, that's like 140 minutes to get free mining time to generate your own blocks. So, pretty scary stuff. And so we're going to talk about a denial of service attack. So this time jack could be kind of a denial of service because you're like cutting the node off from the network. You could also, like hire a botnet and like, ping spam or like flood the target's like network, and basically take them off the network, which gives you again more time to do like a double spend attack. Really quickly, there's something called transaction malleability. This is kind of hard to wrap your mind around, but like if you recall, in a transaction you have a signature that tells you whether or not the transaction is valid. But like due to an implementation quirk or like a math quirk of the ECDSA signature algorithm, the signature RS is equivalent to the signature R negative S mod n. So let's say you control a bunch of nodes on the Bitcoin network. And remember, these nodes are like relaying transactions between each other. When you get a transaction from this target, you like flip their signature to be like negative S, and it still validates as the same transaction, but the hash of the transaction actually changes. So the transaction ID is now different. And so this can be used in a particular attack that was used on like Mt. Gox, for example. This is how Mt. Gox got like millions of dollars siphoned away from them. Basically, someone withdrew money from Mt. Gox. Mt. Gox sends the Bitcoin to this person. This person controls a bunch of nodes, and they change the transaction ID in flight. So now Mt. Gox sees like, oh, the transaction I sent out with this transaction ID never went through. And they're like, oh, we're not going to update our books. That transaction was bad. We'll just like try to send it again or something. And that never works. But the person actually got the Bitcoin. So they can keep doing that and just like siphoning funds forever. And that's how Mt. Gox lost them, like, what, 70,000, 700,000 Bitcoin?
Yeah. Okay, we're going to try to wrap it up real quick. Okay, so for next time, we're going to be talking about Ethereum. There's Ethereum white paper, which is kind of an accessible overview of Ethereum. There's only going to be a few selected sections that we'll want you to read. Some optional reading, you can just read the other subsections. They're pretty interesting. And if the white paper is too casual for you, you want a more mathematical background, try the Ethereum yellow paper, but I'm going to warn you, it's extremely difficult. The main announcement is that next Monday we're hosting Benedict Chan, lead platform engineer of BitGo. He's going to be talking about security of Ethereum contracts and Bitcoin wallets, Ethereum wallets. So come by D-Lab. There's going to be free pizza and beer. All right, see you guys next week. Thank you. Let's get started. So I'll start off by finishing some of the slides from last week, especially because I think people found them pretty interesting. So do a quick buildup of establishing some key points about Bitcoin mining and incentivization. So when you plug in a Bitcoin miner, you're expending electricity, which costs money. And the amount that you're expending is dependent on the hardware efficiency. So you can think of Bitcoin mining as actually turning US dollars into Bitcoin, and as one of the most efficient ways to do so. So you can establish that the mining reward is roughly equal to the mining cost. And if you're roughly breaking even with your mining software, meaning it's really efficient, then that means the marginal cost of acquiring another 51%, or not 51%, of acquiring more hash power is very close to zero. Especially, it would actually even be negative if you are making a profit with your efficient hardware. So what this means is that there's very little marginal cost going all the way up to 51% and attaining 51% hash rate. So you can establish that the cost of acquiring 51% is less than the mining cost. So third point to make, what profits can you actually get from owning 51% of the hash rate? Well, first off, you'd be able to do double spends. So that might crash the value of the currency, but you can recoup those losses and then some by shorting Bitcoin on an alternative exchange, so long as there's enough liquidity. And when you have more than 51% of the mining reward, you can effectively get 100% of the mining reward, or over 51% of the hash power, I meant. Because you can basically only mine on your own blocks, and since you have the majority of the hash power, you're always going to form the longest proof of work chain and exclude anyone else from participating in the network. And the interesting thing is that suppose you had 80% of the hash power. The Bitcoin network would actually still be usable because only 20% of the blocks would be orphaned. And to a normal user on Bitcoin trying to buy coffee or buy whatever goods, this isn't a service interruption for them. So Bitcoin, it's unclear what this would do to the price of Bitcoin if someone acquired 51%. But the main thing we want to establish in this slide is that the value of a 51% attack is greater than the mining reward. So if you combine these together, all these equalities and inequalities, you can actually conclude that the value of a 51% attack is greater than the cost of acquiring 51%, which is a really scary conclusion, meaning that it's actually it's profitable to 51% attack Bitcoin. And the only requirement to do so is to acquire a lot of capital. But if you believe these statements, then the capital isn't an issue because if you have guaranteed profit, like the capital is going to come. So there's some additional ideas to mitigate the kinds of problems that we talked about in the last lecture with pools cannibalizing each other and pool wars going on and a lot of malicious mining strategies. You can measure the amount of pool wars going on just by counting the number of orphan blocks. And what you can do is you can create an insurance contract for Bitcoin stakeholders and people in the Bitcoin community based off of the number of orphan blocks that appear. So that's just like one kind of idea to offset the cost of all these pool wars going on. And to kind of generalize the vulnerabilities that we've talked about with mining, Bitcoin mining is essentially zero sum, and in order to get more than your fair share of the mining reward, what you want to do is you always want to exclude someone else. So there's something called, you could call it members only mining, where you let hash rate continuously join your collusion until you have 80% of the hash rate, and then you exclude everyone else in the network. And this is actually a more profitable strategy than the honest mining strategy. And the other part about this is that if the attack succeeds, you get your increased reward. And the attack actually wouldn't fail. You could just conduct your attack in a way such that it wouldn't start until the 80% threshold or whatever threshold you want to set that's greater than 51% is reached. So from a game theory would say that this collusion would always happen. Another example of this idea of excluding people is you have three pools. They collude and they silently, quietly ignore every 10th block of some other competitive mining pool. And this is actually really hard to detect. You can't, if it's like every 10th block, it's nowhere near statistically significant. And this is still more profitable than the honest strategy. So taking away all these things, it's scary to think how many of these malicious attacks and mining strategies are actually going on today, and we don't even know about it. Lastly, want to make some comments on post-block reward Bitcoin. So as you all know, the block reward of Bitcoin is eventually going to taper off. It cuts in half every 4 years and is going to reach zero in the year 2140. So once it's 2140, the only thing that's supplying the miner's income is transaction fees. So let's really think about that for a second. Let's analyze it. So let's say that in 2140, the average Bitcoin user holds $100,000 in Bitcoin, and over a year they're willing to pay $1,000 in transaction fees. That's a really high number, but $1,000. In order to have miners make any money, the transaction fees must be paid. So you can take this ratio of the transaction fees that you're willing to pay over the amount of Bitcoin that you have and say that that is equal to the cost of attacking over the market cap of Bitcoin. And in our example where the average user holds 100,000 Bitcoin and they're willing to pay an exorbitant $1,000 in fees, that means you only need 1% of the market cap of Bitcoin in order to successfully conduct a 51% attack. That's like another really scary conclusion. Lots of people have suggested Bitcoin should move to proof of stake in the future. But the general idea is that post block reward, Bitcoin needs to have a really high velocity of money in order for it to be secure.